So in this video, we're going to discuss some basic wireless concepts, and we're going to discuss the various wireless LAN standards that are out there. Now, wireless networks encompass both layers 1 and 2 of the OSI model. Obviously, since there's no fiber optic or cable or anything like that to connect to your wireless network card, that it takes care of layer 1, and since wireless LANs have their own frame type, 802.11, to actually send the data across the network, that takes care of layer 2. Ethernet over wireless LAN uses CSMA-CA, that stands for Carrier Sense Multiple Access Collision Avoidance. Now that differs from the standard CSMA-CD access method that regular Ethernet uses. Essentially, with a wireless LAN, each station has a half-duplex connection to the wireless network. In other words, the station can listen or it can transmit, but it cannot do both at the same time like a standard wired computer could. Once a workstation is associated with a wireless access point, each station is basically given the rights to transmit for a certain period of time. So it's really closer to token ring when you think about it, more so than Ethernet. But to be honest, it doesn't really use the Ethernet or the token ring frames on the wire or in the air, as it were. So we don't call it token ring, we call it Wi-Fi or wireless LAN. Now there are two basic modes of wireless networking. The first is ad hoc wireless networking, and it is referred to as IBSS, or Independent Basic Service Set. Ad hoc wireless networking is the type of network where you have, for example, two laptops that need to send data to one another. You can basically configure both laptops with the same SSID or security set identifier and tell them to connect to one another, and they'll connect to one another. And of course at layer 3 they'll probably use those automatic private IP addresses that we talked about in IP networking, but at layers 1 and 2 you can do ad hoc networking between two endpoints. Then we have what's called infrastructure mode, and infrastructure mode is probably the type of wireless network that you're most familiar with. This is where you have a device that has a wireless network card in it, you associate with an access point, and you gain access to the network through that wireless access point. Now within the infrastructure mode of wireless networking, there's two sub-modes, if you will. First is called BSS, or Basic Service Set, and it's used when you have a single access point that doesn't talk to any other access points or communicate with a controller or anything like that. If you have a network that has multiple access points, you're using what's referred to as ESS, or Extended Service Set. And we won't get too much into both the BSS or the ESS modes, if you will, but at least for the ICND1, you have to know what the difference is between BSS and ESS. And really, for what we're concerned about at this point, that's the difference. As a BSS is a single access point, ESS is multiple access points. So let's move on and talk about some of the wireless standards that are out there. All wireless networks are defined under the IEEE 802.11 standard, and if you've done any type of wireless networking, then you know probably all of these standards that I'm about to tell you about, but we'll cover the very basics of how these standards work and what makes them different from one another. There are four basic protocols in use today: the 802.A, B, G, and N, and there's a draft protocol for 802.11ac, but it's not covered on this ICND1 exam. In reality, I don't even think 802.11n is covered, because this exam was written about the time that 802.11n really got popular. However, you never know when they'll throw a question on there about some of the newer technologies, so I'll cover it in at least the same level of detail that I do the other three type of wireless protocols. So first, we're going to talk about 802.11b, and I know you might be asking, why didn't you start with 802.11a? You'll see why here in a bit when we discuss the differences between A and B. 802.11b is very similar to the original 802.11 standard, the 802.11 standard without any letters after it. 802.11b uses the 2.4 GHz band, but allows for higher transmission rates than the standard 802.11 standard. 802.11b allows for 3 different channels and supports data rates of 1 to 5.5 or 11 megabit. Next, we'll move on to 802.11a. 802.11a was actually the first amendment to the 802.11 standard. The original 802.11 standard was almost identical to 802.11b. The only difference is the original standard used data rates of 1 or 2 megabit. 802.11a uses the 5 GHz frequency band. Now the 5 GHz frequency band is not nearly as crowded as the 2.4 GHz. The 2.4 GHz frequency band is used by baby monitors and cordless phones and microwaves and all kinds of interesting radioactive devices, I guess. 5 gigahertz is not nearly as crowded, but because it is a higher frequency, it's more susceptible to interference. It will get absorbed more easily. It can't pass through walls nearly as easily as 802.11b or any of the protocols that use the 2.4 gigahertz band. The 802.11a standard allows for 12 channels and data rates of 6, 9, 12, 18, 24, 36, 48, or 54 megabit, just like the 802.11g standard, which we'll talk about on the next slide. We'll pick up with our discussion of wireless standards in the next video.